Madam Chair, we have a quorum and are ready to start when you are.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Since we've certified a quorum, we'll start with item 2, which is approval of the March 23rd, 2026 meeting summary. If there are no comments, I would entertain a motion.
Move approval.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. And if I could get a second.
Second.
Who was the second? Sorry, I see you unmuted.
Charlie.
Charlie. Thanks, Charlie. Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you. Any opposed? Very good. Thank you. We'll move to item 2, which is discussion and recommendation on the draft 2027-2030 Transportation Improvement Program and amendments to the 2050 Regional Transportation Plan. Ryan.
Thank you, and good afternoon. So this item, bringing this back, we had the information item last month, and just wanted to bring this item back for recommendation to the Transportation Policy Board. If you go to the next slide. I went in depth on this this slide in particular last month, but always like to talk about the relationship between the Regional Transportation Improvement Program as well as the TIP and the RTP. Excuse me. And again, when projects in the RTP really sets up projects for federal funding, and then once they actually are selected for federal funding, they are then included and submitted into the Transportation Improvement Program so that the Policy Board can approve those projects, which is a requirement for federal funding to be obligated to specific projects. What we're doing today, we are doing the spring amendment cycle for the 2050 Regional Transportation Plan. This is just a regular twice a year amendments for the RTP. And then we adopt a new tip every 2 years. And so this item is for the adoption of the 27 to 2030 Transportation Improvement Program. One thing I do want to point out is that there are no amendments to the current Transportation Improvement Program, which is the 25 to 28. Normally we will be amending that at the same time as the 2730, but we don't have any submitted regular amendments for the tip, the current tip. So that tip is complete and will be active until the Federal Highway Administration approves this upcoming tip. Bob, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, under the transportation plan, you have 20-year horizon. Is that a 20-year horizon or a 25-year horizon?
I believe it's 25 years for us. The federal regulations say a minimum of 20 years, and that's where that number comes from.
You say 20 plus?
20 plus, I guess, is probably the best way to put it, but we do 25.
Yes.
Yeah, no, good clarification. So ours is a 25-year plan, but 20-year horizon is the minimum per federal standards. So thanks. We'll get the next slide. So just a quick overview, since the majority of this item is really regarding the 27 to 2030 tip. You do have the actual project listings in your backup materials. We do have, again, 32 projects under the highway category from 6 sponsors totaling $3.8 billion. Again, highway, the project type is really regarding where the funding is coming from. So highway means Federal Highway Administration. So this doesn't just mean highway projects, it just means anything that's funded through programs that are administered by the Federal Highway Administration. And likewise on the transit side, this is funding that comes through the Federal Transit Administration. And that includes 41 projects from 4 sponsors. We have 4 designated recipients of federal funding for transit in the region, the city of Round Rock, city of San Marcos, and then Austin Transit Partnership and Cap Metro. Those are the 4 sponsors included there, and that's $737 million worth of federal funding and some local funding as well in there as well. Always like to point out the group projects are not listed in your backup materials and will not be listed in the actual document of the tip. However, there is a dashboard that TxDOT puts together for this, but groups projects, it's always important to bring those up because these are projects that do have federal funding. But because of the nature of the scope of the project, they have a streamlined approval process. These include safety projects, maintenance projects, and some other programs, including transportation alternatives, are typically get a faster approval process. So we have 330 group projects that are included in the region through 10 project sponsors, and that's an additional $889 million worth of funding. And then on the next slide, we have 4 amendments to the regional transportation plan. I'll let Will walk you through those.
Thank you, Ryan. As Ryan mentioned, we just have 4 amendments for the RTP. One of them is for a constrained project in Burnett County, basically updating an interchange reconstruction to include the addition of 2 lane frontage roads in each direction. The other 3 amendments are for the illustrative list. So these are projects that are not fiscally constrained. One is a project modification for SH 142 between SH 80 and SH 130 in Caldwell County. The other 2 are new listings for the illustrative list. These are projects that weren't in the RTP until now, but they are in the illustrative list and not fiscally constrained. One is our construction U-turns on SH 45 and Starkman. The other is for a 4-lane to 6-lane divided roadway, US 290 between Roger Hanks and east of Rob Shelton Drive in Hayes County.
Thanks, Will. And this is just a visual representation of the amendments in the region and the map that we took out for public outreach. And speaking of public outreach, we'll go to the next slide and I'll hand that over to Joyce to talk about our public comment period and what we heard from the public.
Thanks, Ryan. So the public comment period was open from March 16th through April 20th. That included 7 in-person open house events. There was also the online open house for the entire duration. The online open house and the in-person events included the same material and information. And in addition to being able to learn more and make comments in person and online, we also had the option to receive information by mail and return that to us, and also make comments by phone. We received 79 comments. All of those actually were through email, and there was just, to summarize, primarily a request for more bike and ped projects. I know Ryan and I always like to point out that even though many of the roadway projects are listed in the roadway category, they also have a bike and ped element to them. So that is the information that we received during this outreach period, and I will turn it back over to Ryan.
Thank you, Joyce. So that concludes the presentation. We are requesting that the Technical Advisory Committee make a recommendation to the Policy Board regarding the upcoming 27 to 2030 TIP, as well as the amendments to the 2050 RTP, and we'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan and Joyce. Anyone have any questions, comments? Okay, not seeing any hands. Can I get a motion, please?
So move.
Thank you, Bob. Second?
Second by Ed
I'll-
Collins.
Thank you, Ed. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any
Aye.
opposed? Any opposed? Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, we'll move to item 4, discussion and recommendation on the 2026 federal performance measure targets. Narev.
Thank you. Slide. In 2012, Congress passed legislation that mandated that state DOTs, NPOs, and transit authorities adopt what's known as the Transportation Performance Management System, essentially a process to understand whether the investment and policy decisions that we make are actually meeting national policy goals. CAMPO utilizes this process through a variety of our actions, including performance-based project selection criteria, monitor the progress and impact of our investments, and then we also include them in our planning products such as the TIP, the plan, and our studies. We also adopt targets, which is what we are here to do today. Next slide, please. On the left of your slide, you see our performance measure goal areas, which are assigned by Congress. That is up to the Federal Highway Administration and Federal Transit Administration to come up with goals and performance measures. And that is the responsibility of state DOTs, MPOs, and transit authorities. It's not only create targets, but also plans and programs designed to meet those targets. Next slide, please. So these are the targets that we are going to ask the board to adopt. There are 25 in total over 5 categories. In the second column, what you see outside of the brackets are this year's targets, and inside the columns were last year's targets. I think that is the extent of my presentation. The next slide is just the staff requesting that the TAC make a recommendation to the policy board to adopt the 2026 performance measure report and targets. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you. Bob.
Just curious, could you please say why any of the targets have changed? Is that because TxDOT's changed them, or?
Yes, so TxDOT adopts what's known as, so the way the federal regulations say is that TxDOT has to look at 5-year rolling averages for the previous 5 years, and then extrapolate what they expect to happen next year. So that's essentially where the target information comes from.
Thank you.
Okay, Richard.
I turned my mic back on, sorry. Thank you, Chair, for the recognition, and thank you for CAMPO staff for putting this together. I would like to make a motion to amend the PM1 targets, and I would like to make a motion to use the targets from the CAMPO State of Safety report, which are regional in nature, in lieu of the statewide targets that are indicated on safety PM1. And I have what those are from the CAMPO State of Safety report. And for the number of fatalities, and I'm going to lean on Cole to correct me if I got this number incorrect, but that number from the CAMPO's Data Safety Report is 239. Did I get that right, Cole?
That's right.
For the rate of fatalities, the CAMPO's Data Safety Regional Report is 1.29. For number of serious injuries, the CAMPO State of Safety Regional Report is 1,106. For rate of serious injuries, that number is 5.68. And for the number of non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries, that number is 176. So that's my motion. You may recall at the April 13th, 2026 Transportation Policy Board meeting, board member, council member Lane from City of Austin indicated that she would support replacing the statewide safety targets with regionally specific targets that were developed with the CAMPO State of Safety report. And it's likely she would make a similar motion at the upcoming TPB meeting. So I wanted to get us a little ahead of that for consideration and discussion here at the TAC. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I hear that as a motion. So Bob, I see your hand. I'll see if there's a second first, then we can enter into discussion. Is there a second for that motion?
Second from Cole.
Okay, thank you. Bob?
Just a question of pure ignorance on my part. Are there any negative ramifications to any of the CAMPO members if those targets are not met? Does it affect our funding, federal funding in any way? Or potentially affect our funding?
Bob, I appreciate the question. So we actually had last Thursday our monthly meeting with the Federal Highway Administration, where we brought up whether we could adopt declining targets. Their response was that we could adopt declining targets as long as they reflected the data that showed from past crash data. And when we asked about road to zero or vision zero targets, which are essentially the same, road to zero that's what's reflected in the state safety report, tries to cut traffic fatalities by half by 2035 and reduce it to zero by 2050. And when we asked the Federal Highway Administration about that, they said that not only does what Federal Highway Administration called Vision Zero and Road to Zero are essentially an aspirational performance target. And they said not only was it discouraged, but it was strongly discouraged. That was the language that they sent to us direct in writing. So are there negative ramifications for adopting Road to Zero targets and then not meeting them? No, but given that we are discussing with Federal Highway Administration right now about certifying the MPO, making sure that we are following federal law, federal guidance. There might be some complications with our certification process if we have shown that despite being strongly discouraged to not adopt Road to Zero targets, they may not look too kind on that. So in terms of complications, that probably is the biggest one.
Was there any explanation given as to why FHWA was providing that direction to CAMPO staff?
Yes. So it was again a question that we received by not only Councilmember Fuentes, but also Councilmember Lane at the Transportation Policy Board meeting in April, and Ashby did promise that we would be part of the agenda item that we have with our Federal Highway Administration representative. So that's essentially the reason that we asked the question in the first place.
No, but I guess I'm so confused. I'm still trying to figure out why would FHWA say don't use the aspirational goals?
Okay, so
I'm just trying to understand the logic if there's not a penalty or something.
So the logic is that this has just been part of their guidance from the birth of the Transportation Performance Management System process. It's been noted in two separate federal frequently asked questions guidance that they put out. When they provide guidance for potential rulemaking, they include it. So this is kind of like a consistent message that they put out from the beginning about aspirational targets, probably because it's a question they've gotten before from other MPOs and DOTs across the country.
So FHWA is trying to discourage us from using aspirational targets. Is that a correct understanding?
Strongly discourage is the exact words that they use, but yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ed, do you have a question or a comment?
Yes, I was wondering, does the board need to take action at their next meeting on these goals, or is there a little more time that would allow CAMPO staff to put together some information? Because kind of have this kind of presented, and we're just kind of learning new information, but maybe the staff needs some additional time, maybe working with the different board members as well as the city of Austin to come up with a paper or just a position on it, as opposed to kind of getting sideways, potentially getting sideways with this particular regulation.
Yeah, so I mean, the board will need to take action at the May meeting. We are presenting the TIP and plan amendments for adoption. And when Federal Highways and the TxDOT is looking to approve those adoptions, they'll want to see whether we also adopted the performance targets of 2026. They'll need to see the adoption, they'll need to see the resolution, and they'll need to see it on our website. So it has to be done at the May meeting.
So I would suggest that the staff needs to, provide some additional information. We didn't get that information that you just presented to us, so it's kind of hard to make an informed decision as far as a recommendation, but maybe the staff can put information together that'll help the board understand the various nuances of what we're trying to do.
I guess if I could ask to your point, Ed, Narev, did y'all compare what is in the motion that Richard made to what you're recommending, and would recommend still what you put forward today?
So what's being recommended is showing a rapidly declining number that is not tied to past data. So that's the part where it doesn't conform to federal guidance.
Okay, Brian, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, so I guess my question, maybe back to Mr. Mendoza, is what do they see as the benefits of showing different numbers in this way? I mean, these are measuring performance against measured experience, right? So what's the benefit of showing them the way that you're asking them to be shown?
It's basically just a matter of philosophy that we should use targets that are more applicable to our CAMPO region here locally than statewide. And I do understand that these aspirational numbers that were taken from the CAMPO State of Safety report in some instances are drastically less than the statewide figures. But, it's just a matter of philosophy. Should we be aspiring to achieve the expected results that, people can see and feel from our infrastructure investments?
Okay, Charlie?
Yeah, I was just wondering, we're looking at this, graphic here, and you got your safety PM1, and obviously those are all, TxDOT statewide numbers. Is there any way we can, put right next to those, CAMPO region adopted regional numbers, and that's what our region's, attempting to go at. But we'll let the state numbers be what they are, but this is what our region's looking at. I don't know if that's a possibility, or is there no way of really messing with this kind of setup the way they've got it, if that makes sense. And that's, I guess, to CAMPO.
Sure. No, I appreciate that, Charlie. I think, so the way we've been doing it right is, we just follow the board's process that we've followed ever since we've had to adopt this. So if the board wants us to provide regional targets as well as, just contributing towards meeting the statewide targets, that's something that I think is going to require an action on the board side, instead of just something that staff could choose to do.
Yeah, I don't know if the city does. I mean, if that's acceptable to the city to continue to show, state, and then I don't know. I'll let them chime in on that. But just a suggestion.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Charlie. This is Richard. I think that would be a step in the right direction.
Mike?
Yeah, and I think my question / comment probably follows Charlie's, which was, is there a way to do both, which is to show that we are supporting the state targets, but then also showing that we are committed to trying to achieve the regional targets as well that Richard had mentioned, and that we have established for CAMPO. If there's a way to bridge that and do both, I think that might be maybe just kind of a middle ground. Because one thing I definitely wouldn't want to do is compromise our position, with FHWA, based on some of the conversations that y'all have had as staff with them. It sounds like, also, this is probably another question, but I think I know the answer, which is, it sounds like they're really interested in attainable targets that are based on prior safety data. And so if that's the case, then I would want to achieve that objective while also trying to attain our regional targets.
Thanks, Mike. That's, really helpful. And I think we've tried in the past to bridge that gap with the other work that we've done through the state safety report and the regional safety action plans that we've been working with the various counties. So I mean, that is something that we can definitely consider for sure.
Cole?
Hi, I just wanted to provide maybe additional background and context for comparison's sake. If people haven't looked at the state of safety report in a while, the numbers that we're referencing come from a table on page 75, and it shows our actual performance from 2024 was 283, but it also shows, I think, the 5-year average from prior historical years. And so what we were suggesting for fatalities was 239 based on the near-term target in the table. And the last time we accomplished that was 238 fatalities from between 2014 and 2018. And so, I mean, when we talk about like aspirational goal, I don't know who knows the right answer to that, but that's a real number and it's been seen in the region. So to me, it doesn't feel like we're pulling numbers randomly out of a hat that are just lower. They're targets for improved performance that we've seen in the region. So they're attainable. And so I think at the bottom line is we're trying to assess our progress back towards those numbers.
So the only response I would have to that is, again, federal law states, federal regulations, that the numbers have to be derived from past performance data, either 5-year rolling average, going back 5 years and then extrapolating based on that average, what you expect 2026 to be, or what the next year to be. I don't know if federal highways would, how they would react to us saying, well, we once attained it one year ago or a few years ago, so we think we can attain it again. I don't know how receptive they would be to that message.
This is Chad McCowan at CAMPO. I'd just like to just add on to what Nirav had mentioned earlier. We did, take the discussion on board from the board at the last meeting and have initiated this conversation as soon as we could with Federal Highway Administration to talk about this further. So we have introduced the idea to them, and we're getting that guidance and having that conversation now on what we may be able to do. But obviously, figuring that out takes time. We've had different interpretations, I'd say, on the past on what we use, but we definitely are gathering that information right now to be able to present in the future. But given that we just had the federal highway meeting immediately after the board meeting, we're still working through that right now. Thanks.
And Chad, just to clarify, when you say that you're working through, that doesn't mean that even by the time the policy board meets, that y'all would have that ready to roll. You're thinking of next year's targets. Is that right?
That's what I'm thinking. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mike.
But we are definitely looking at that and the implications.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, so based on that, I mean, it feels like I think all of us are kind of trying to put our head around this. My question is this so time sensitive that we can't maybe push this conversation out to give a little more time to get some of that information back from FHWA? It sounds like there might be some more information to come in that might help it in the decision making of both the TAC and the policy board on this. I guess that would be one question. So in other words, is it an option to maybe push this out, maybe table this for another cycle of meetings, and then get some more information that might better inform both bodies?
It sounded like that might affect when the tip goes to the board, but Narev, can you help us with that question?
No, Emily, you remembered it correctly. When we go to the board in May, we have to adopt it at the May meeting. So unfortunately, that's why we kind of try to have the information and recommendation, information and action cadence to have these conversations. Unfortunately, it's just happening at the recommendation timeline, but we do need to adopt these performance measures in May.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Okay. Bob?
So is it possible to amend this in the future to, after we get perhaps some additional discussion and clarification with FHWA? Right now, they've given us, I think it appears staff believes, clear direction that we really need to be using the numbers that we see on the screen, but that they may be open to discussion to change those numbers. And so if staff was able to get them on board with a change in the numbers to meet the city's requests, it seems to me this is something that we could amend in the future at that time that we finally got FHWA on board. Is that possible?
I think it is. To have that conversation is possible. A good time would be in late June when we have our recertification review with Federal Highway Administration. It'll be just CAMPO staff and various representatives from both Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration. I think that'd be an ideal time to have that conversation.
But then figure out an avenue by which we could amend our goals to make them be more regional as the city has requested rather than be statewide.
Yes.
Figure out a path.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, we'd have to see if that's a path that's open in the first place, for sure.
Richard, is that something that would be amenable to you guys?
Oh, you're muted, Richard.
So, Bob and the rest of my TAC colleagues, I really appreciate the dialogue around this. In terms of, from the city's perspective, is this time sensitive? No, it is not, but it is something that, from what I'm aware, we have brought up before for consideration in past adoptions of the safety plan. I think I can take some of this conversation that we had today and take it forward to our city TPB board members, namely Councilmember Lane, and explain to her the nuances between having to vet this with FHWA, the timing of this necessity and adoption of the TIP in the RTP, and a plan to revisit this during the, I believe, June timeframe for potential amendment to the plan in the next round. So that's what I'll take forward. Thank you all.
Thanks. And Richard, it's going to be late June, so after the June board meeting, so please make sure you tell them that too.
Got it.
Thank you.
Okay, so Richard, with that, would you consider amending your motion to recommend approval with this, with a note to have staff bring this back forward to the TAC after the meetings with FHWA in the future?
Yes, I would like to amend my motion to recommend approval of this item with the stipulation that we will follow up with FHWA in late June for consideration of adopting regional targets versus statewide targets in the next round.
Okay. Thank you. And do I have a second for that motion?
Second.
Thank
And I
you,
do have a
Cole.
question for clarification as well.
Go ahead.
Back on the previous slide, the text says new targets indicated in brackets. And so is it 3,046 number of fatalities is the new target, or is it 4,506 as shown in the report that says 2026 targets?
Yeah, no, it's outside the brackets. It's supposed to be the new target. That is very old language that was left over from a very old slide that somehow made its way back. So thanks for catching that. I'll make sure I strip it out before we go to the board.
So just to further clarify, the recommendation is actually based on the numbers outside of the brackets.
Yes.
Okay. Any other comments? Okay. So
I have a question on the clarification of what the motion is at this point. So the motion at this point, to clarify, Richard, is not to approve adopting the regionals, but to instead approach FHWA for consideration of incorporating those and adopting those in June. Is that correct?
Yeah, the motion is to approve the currently stated statewide targets with the stipulation we will revisit with FHWA in late June to consider regional targets in the next round.
Thank you.
Okay. There are no more comments. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay. Any opposed? Okay. Thank you so much. We will move to item 5 under information section of the agenda, briefing on the interchange bottleneck study. Will.
Thank you, Emily. So in February, we provided an update to the TAC on the interchange bottleneck study. At that point, we described our process of prioritizing regional interchanges and major arterial intersections and the development of a few improvement concepts at a short list of locations. This update or this briefing today is to discuss the final report that has been compiled and was included in the background packet for the TAC agenda. And so I'd like to hand things over to our consultants at HDR to run through the presentation. Leslie, are you online?
I am. Thank you, Will. All right, so you have seen the bottleneck study before. Today we're going to cover some of the same information, the project goals, the prioritization process, our top locations and recommendations. That'll be a quick refresh. And then we're going to spend a little more time on the delay savings and project costs and some of the next steps as we're moving forward. Next slide. To recap, our goals were to understand which interchanges had high congestion and high crashes in the region, to prioritize those locations, and then to facilitate project readiness by developing recommendations, concepts, and probable construction costs of 4 interchanges. Next slide. We started out with 72 interchanges across the region. And through this study, we prioritize those to a smaller focus group. Next slide. Our prioritization criteria included traffic safety, traffic operations, economics and demographics, and the built environment. And we use that weighting criteria to score each of the 72 locations. Next slide. So ultimately, we had a list of 15 locations. And we investigated each of those locations to come up with 4 where we developed recommendations. These were 71 in Riverside, I-35 and RM12, I-35 and SH80, and Loop 1 and FM 734. Next slide. At each of those locations, we completed a crash analysis, a traffic operational analysis, and a high-level ITS assessment. We use that information to develop interchange concepts, which you'll see, and recommendations, as well as probable construction costs. Next slide. We've engaged stakeholders throughout. We started at the very beginning with a pre-prioritization questionnaire to help get feedback on which bottleneck locations we would choose. We developed an innovative intersection questionnaire, and we had 7 stakeholder meetings, especially those with our key stakeholders that were in the area of those 4 selected locations. Right now, our final report is with our key stakeholders for feedback. Next slide. In the near term, we focused improvements very much on safety and some quick operational improvements that could be made. We looked at access management, other safety improvements, active transportation infrastructure, illumination. For capacity, we looked at lengthening and adding turn lanes at interchanges. In the long term, the improvements were more substantial. It was rebuilding the whole interchange, adding direct connects, adding U-turns. And a lot of these improvements would need to be implemented with a larger project, a corridor widening project. Next slide. So y'all have seen these before, so I'll do a high-level refresh on each one of them. At 71 and Riverside, we only looked at near-term improvements. And at this location, our focus really was on pedestrian safety. We recommended some active transportation infrastructure. We did some curb extensions and illumination at this interchange. Next slide. At I-35 and Wonderworld RM12, we looked at both safety and operations. You can see on the frontage road approaches, we recommended some capacity improvements at the interchanges. We also looked at access management on Wonderworld Drive, east of I-35. Next slide. Long-term at this location, we recommended reconstruction of the interchange. This recommendation aligns with TxDOT's long-term study at this location. We fine-tuned it and finessed it for some of the volumes that we were seeing at the interchange. Next slide. All right, at I-35 and 80, this is currently a displaced left turn interchange. A lot of the improvements were related to crashes and driver unease, driver expectancy with the innovative intersection. So we recommended some physical improvements to the crossover movements, some access management, closing driveways, and improving signage throughout this whole area. Next slide. Long term, at SH80, we went to a conventional diamond interchange with a widened cross-section of Hopkins SH80 to that 6-lane configuration. And that was very much in conversation with the city of San Marcos and how they were heading at that intersection. Next slide. All right, we're at our last interchange, Loop 1 in Parmer. We hit on a variety of improvements here. We looked at improving bicycle maneuvers through the interchange, adding a shared use path, adding some pedestrian amenities. We improved capacity on the northbound frontage road and implemented some access management recommendations east of the interchange. Next slide. Finally, long-term at this interchange, we looked at reconstruction of the bridge structure to add capacity internal to the diamond, provide U-turn lanes both directions, and provide a northbound to westbound direct connect onto Parmer. Next slide. For each location, we completed a benefit cost evaluation. The benefits, we looked at annual user savings, and that's comprised of 2 pieces. One is delay savings, how long vehicles are waiting at the interchange and the cost of that time. as well as the crash savings, so cost attributable to injuries or property damage associated with those crashes. And we compared it to our estimated improvement cost. For near term, we looked at $20-30. And each of the locations, we expected to see a return on the investment of under 3 years. Next slide. Long term, we only looked at the 3 locations. And at those 3 locations, we saw a return on investment. No, I'm sorry. At RM12 and at Parmer, we saw a return on investment in less than 5 years. I think it's important to note that at I-35 and SH-80, we had a much more significant time period to recoup that investment of over 40 years. And there's a couple of reasons that attributed to that. One, you can see the user savings here are much lower. This interchange did have significant delay, but it was limited to specific movements, and it wasn't all around the interchange like the other 2 locations were. And also the improvement costs are substantial. When we widened SH-80 to the 6-lane section, it required moving the columns and reconstructing the I-35 bridge. And when you do that, you have to get the correct vertical clearance, which extends it down I-35 a significant distance. So overall, this improvement, we would recommend go forward with an I-35 type program. It couldn't be a standalone improvement at Hopkins. Next slide. All right, as we're wrapping up this bottleneck study, we wanted to talk about how we can take it forward. We're recommending that the stakeholders continue with our concepts and cost estimates to help design and implement those near-term improvements, and that our long-term improvements get incorporated into larger planning studies like for I-35 or Hopkins Street. Finally, that prioritization list we made at the beginning of the project doesn't have to be limited to being used for this bottleneck study. It's a great list of intersections that could use investment, that could use evaluation, and we can continue to build on that list beyond the duration of this project. We will be briefing the policy board in 2 weeks at their May meeting. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Leslie and Will. Do you have anybody have any questions or comments? Cole.
Hi, thanks. I am curious if we have any triple lefts anywhere in the CAMPO region, or where do we see that being done?
I've seen it in other locations. It's a good point, and we talked about that a lot at that improvement, but I don't recall ones in the CAMPO region right now. I will see if I can find that information and get it to y'all. I've seen a lot in other areas, but less, like Dallas and Houston, but not as frequent here.
And then I was also curious for that interchange at Mopac and Parmer, whether a diverging diamond intersection was evaluated.
We did a quick ICE analysis, intersection control evaluation at each of these locations. And that one would work, but the retail on the southeast corner really complicates access to the innovative intersections. So we ended up keeping it as a traditional diamond just because of all the commercial access in that southeast quadrant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cole. Anyone else have any comments or questions? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Leslie and Will.
Thank you.
We will move to item 6, discussion on the 2028-2031 call for projects. Ryan.
Thank you. So we are closing in on the end of the call for projects process, and appreciate everyone's patience. Today, I wanted to just give you kind of a final update before we head into the results in the next couple of weeks. So we had an executive committee meeting this morning. We did not have a chance to present this, but Today, I really want to kind of talk about where we are in the process, how things are shaping up, and revisit the risk assessment framework that we discussed last month. I know everyone was very quiet, so I wanted to just double check with everyone if there's any opinions on that. But as far as when we're going to be releasing everything, so we had our risk review meeting on the 22nd last Wednesday. That's where everyone that was involved with reviewing risk, we had about, I think, 12 people in attendance. We went through all of your projects to refine and just revisit all of our individual risk assessments to make a determination on the projects. And then on Thursday, we're doing the same thing, except for we're discussing the scores themselves and making sure that everything is where it needs to be, and doing QA/QC on all of those materials. And all the while, we're continuing to do QA/QC and make sure everything is ready to go. Our intent is to release the draft results, including the risk assessments on your individual projects, along with the scores, on the May 4th agenda send out, the packet for the policy board. And then we'll discuss that at the policy board meeting, and of course with you all at the next TAC meeting, which is 3 weeks from today. It's a little early, I think, because of the holiday the next week, but that'll be an in-depth discussion. But if you'll go to the next slide, I did just want to remind everyone that even though I'm the one always presenting all of this information and have been doing all the presentations during the lead up for the application period, that we have a large team that's doing all of this work. We have at least a minimum of 9 reviewers on each individual project. We have 3 reviewers who have independently reviewed the risk of your individual projects, 3 independent reviewers doing a benefit evaluation, and then 3 reviewers conducting the cost benefit analysis. And so 9 people are touching your applications and reviewing those. What those meetings are for that I mentioned earlier is that if there's any discrepancies, if we are seeing something different out of the 3 reviewers, we sit down and we talk about it. We want to figure out why someone is saying that this has a low risk, someone else says this has a moderate risk, things like that. We've had a lot of in-depth discussions, and so it's important for us to come to a consensus. And so when you see the results coming out, the full report will be out in about 3 weeks, but we'll send out the preliminary list and results next week. But I want you to understand that those results are the result of a large team putting those results together. If you go to the next slide. So I wanted to revisit this slide and focus on a particular section of it. This was the determination framework. When we did this project call last year, it was either you were ready or you were not. I think that was one thing early on that the risk assessment team was asking about, and is that there's certain projects that we think there's low risk, which is it's ready to go, and we'll be recommending those for sure. Based on the score, of course, but those are ready to go. We don't foresee any problems for that project. Should be able to let on schedule, on time, and on budget, which are kind of the 3 core principles that underlie the risk assessment. We want to make sure that if the board awards it, it's going to move forward, it's funded, the budget and the cost estimate all make sense, and it's going to stay on schedule, and we're going to get what we pay for, essentially, or the board is going to get what they pay for along with the region. Moderate risk is kind of a new thing. So that was one of those where we've got really good projects that may have some minor issues that we've identified, but issues that don't really impact the whole recommendation as a whole. And there are issues that we think can be rectified almost immediately. So they're very, very small issues. This could be a typo in the cost estimate or things like that. And just minor issues that we will be requesting that those sponsors, like we're going to be making a contingent recommendation that the policy board go ahead and approve them, but that we're going to ask for the local sponsors. They're basically going to have a little bit of additional homework to get us some corrected information just to make sure that everything's in place so that we can move it into the low risk and then program it in the transportation improvement program in the fall along with the low risk projects. High risk projects are kind of the opposite, where we are not going to be recommending those because we've identified serious flaws within the application itself. And that could be the most common case we've seen is a very serious flaw with the cost estimate. Either we don't know where those numbers are coming from, we didn't get an itemized budget, so we don't know what the funding is being spent on. That puts it automatically in a higher risk category. because we aren't sure that project is going to be able to move forward on budget. And then critical risk, those aren't possible to recommend. There's a few projects that are critical risk. These are projects that even if the board decided to award these projects and we just didn't have enough information, they won't be able to get an advanced funding agreement. Federal Highways will not approve them because there is no information to approve. Essentially, these are, best way to think about these are they're incomplete applications for the most part. And so those aren't even going to be possible to recommend. On the next slide, I've kind of alluded to a lot of this information, but and where your focus is and where our focus is as well is the difference between moderate and high risk, because that is kind of the cutoff line for the recommendation. And we want to be very, very diligent and very careful about where we assign projects. We don't want to be assigning a project moderate risk when it's really a high risk. And we don't want to be pushing anybody's project into the high risk category when it's actually a moderate risk and can be addressed really quickly. And so underneath each of these, you'll kind of see the bullet points that are kind of guiding the way we're thinking about this. As I mentioned, under moderate risk, it is contingent. Lower risk, minor issues identified. We have a bunch of moderate risks that have resolution language that didn't really had some minor issues with it, so we're going to be asking for a new resolution, but they did provide a resolution, but that's something we see that can be fixed within 60 days. And we don't endorse programming them until those issues are addressed. And critically, I think the last bullet point on both of these are kind of the critical definer between the two. Issues that are considered moderate do not impact other projects, and that means it doesn't impact how much funding we recommend on a project. And the reason why that's the key differentiator is that if we have an issue, a high risk issue, say with the cost estimate, that impacts how much funding we are recommending to be put on that project. And that impacts how much funding we have available for other projects. So the way to think about moderate risk is that that issue is isolated to that project alone, and it does not impact the entire portfolio of projects. That is really the key differentiator, and the thing in the back of my mind and the team's mind when we're assigning one or the other is that moderate, that's an isolated issue. High risk is an issue that impacts everybody else's projects and availability of funding for those projects. And again, high risk, as I was mentioning, cost estimate is probably the most significant issue that pushed a project into high risk. But there are a lot of other issues as well that we've identified as high risk. So what we will be doing in the draft recommendation that you'll see next week is we'll have a high level summary of why of the risk of your project and why we're determining that it's high risk versus moderate risk. And you'll have a little description, a few sentences. The full report will have a complete breakdown of your risk assessment using that checklist that was provided in the backup materials and in the guide that everyone had available. That checklist that we used will be made available, and a summary of those issues will be provided. But I'm going to stop right there. Well, actually, I'll go talk about the pending results real quick. But I do want to get, particularly on the moderate, on that previous slide, I want to get feedback from you all on that. So pending results, again, as I was saying, these are pending. I do think critical and low risk, those are very obvious. So we have 16 projects that are low risk, and we have 13 projects that are critical risk. Where we're spending a lot of time is in the 38 projects that are moderate and the 54 projects that are high risk. So you will see a little change in there. We're continuing to do that QA/QC. Do feel like we'll have a few high risk projects move into moderate. We want to be very, very careful about designating our project as high risk when it could potentially be moderate risk. And so we may see those numbers change a little bit, but we're spending a lot of time on that, and rightfully so. And I think that's where your focus will be when you see the results as well. And then on the last slide, really, again, this is one that you saw last month with a different slide, but really when it comes to the recommendation, there's really two things that I always think about, and I hope that you will think about, and the policy board will think about as well, is that you have to have a good project, but you also have to have an application that accurately represents that project through this process. And those two things have to go hand in hand. You can't have a good project with a really bad application, and you can't have a bad application. Yeah, a good application with a really bad project because it's not going to have regional value. You have to have both of those, I think, to have that recommendation. And that at the end of the day, we're looking for projects that are low risk, they are ready for the phase that they are submitted for, they have a regional impact, and they have a good return on investment and cost, and they're cost effective for the region. And then the application itself needs to be completed. It needs to be clear and accurate, and we need to be able to have confidence when we go to the policy board saying we feel very confident this project is ready because we have a very clear application. It gave us the information we needed to make that assessment. And to do that, you had to have followed the process. We had a very thorough process, and for a reason, because I think with all projects, there's a chance that something's going to go wrong. And when it comes to a risk, we are trying to minimize that as much as possible. And to make sure that things can move forward as promised in the application. And through that, we verify all of the information. But anyways, that's kind of my spiel. Love to get your feedback, particularly on the risk assessment matrix. I know everybody was very quiet last month, and this is really the last time that y'all are going to see me before you're either happy with me or you're upset with me. And I want to make sure that we are. This is a very important process and a very critical thing. And one thing I did mention to the policy board as well is that this is their decision. This is just staff's recommendation based on the process that we put forward. And we're doing the best we can for the region and for you all. I do want to say that we do have the draft results are going to be finalized at the end of this week, but it does look like everything has been, as things are shaping up, it looks like everybody is shaping up to be fairly distributed across the region. It looks like most, if not all, sponsors are going to products are scoring well and considered in the low to moderate risk category. So it is shaping up, I think, the way it did in 2018, where everything was fairly well distributed. I think that is a factor of the process working as intended. It balances mode, it balances sponsors, it balances geographic location, I think, so far. Obviously, we're still QA/QCing it, but I think that's an important thing to think about. I think it's shaping up the way it should. But with that, I'll take questions, specific or general. So thank you.
So thank you, Ryan. It's like a pretty thorough process, and I know everyone's anxiously awaiting the results of it. Anyone have any comments or questions for Ryan? Richard? Oh, you're muted.
All right. It happens again, I'm fired. I'll be 3 times. Thank you, Ryan, for the presentation. So I wasn't on the TAC for the last call for projects, I think in 2019. And I probably should know this, but this will be brought forward for a TAC recommendation on the candidate list of projects for a board presentation.
Yeah, so it is a financial item, but we are asking for a recommendation if you'd like to provide one. And I think the recommendation on the process is the most important thing to me, so that you're endorsing the process that we use and that staff followed that process by the book. I think that's the most important thing for me, is that that we conducted this process appropriately. I think it's the most important thing for me. So yeah.
Well, from my perspective, I think it was a very wholesome process, and again, appreciate the amount of diligence applied. Can you remind me again how much available funding we forecast for this call?
Yeah, it's $378 million between the 3 programs. The majority of it is Surface Transportation Block Grant. I'd say that's 90% of the funding. We do have carbon reduction funding in there as well, and transportation alternative set-aside funding. Carbon reduction is very, very small. And again, and kind of bringing up the funding piece, obviously with Congress, we're assuming a continuing resolution on the current bill, because the IIJA does, the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, the current authorization bill does expire in October of this year. So we'll be watching Congress very, very closely, but we'll be in the middle of programming these in the tip one way or the other. But that is something we definitely need to keep a sharp eye on. And then the other thing is that it was like $1.2 billion worth of requests that were submitted against that 378.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Cole?
Thanks, Ryan. Can you clarify whether all projects will get scored or only those that are low and moderate risk?
Yeah, we scored all of them. We did them all simultaneously, so we would score them regardless. On the critical risk projects, it was really hard to score a few of those because there was no information really to evaluate, but we did. You'll receive a score and a risk assessment together on all projects if we were able to do it. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else have any comments or questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Ryan. We'll move to item 7, update on regional truck parking plan. Narep.
Thank you. In September 2024, the policy board adopted the regional freight plan. And one of those items that the freight plan adopted as an item of need was the lack of truck parking in the region. In a few slides, you'll see why truck parking is so important to our region. But from that plan, CAMPO staff sent out a procurement. And in September of 2025, we identified the team of WSP and Cambridge Systematics to develop a regional truck parking plan to identify locations that might be suitable for truck parking in our region. Elizabeth Welch from WSP is online, and she will be leading the presentation today. Lizzie.
Thank you, Nirav. All right, next slide. So as Nirav mentioned, we'll go over today why we're doing a truck parking plan, a bit about the plan, schedule, and overview, go over some early findings so far, and then a quick look ahead on what else you can expect to see out of this effort. Next slide. So as to why we're doing this plan, people think of truck parking often as a private sector issue, but it really is a three-pronged public and private issue. You've got the public safety aspect that aligns with federal regulations for the hours of service. So kind of a generalization, drivers need to take a 30-minute break every 8 hours. They can only be on duty for 14 hours. And after that's done, they have to be off duty for 10. So that's one reason drivers need to park. There's also just the logistics needs. So if they need to make an appointment in the morning, they may stage the night before within about 2 hours of their customers, or on the same day, they might need to find somewhere to wait closer to the customer to get there. So that could be right outside the building on street parking, or it could be somewhere designated. This is also affected by just the increased kind of tightening of delivery windows. As you see kind of these faster logistics patterns, those windows that drivers are allowed to pick up and drop off are getting shorter. But then to the public impacts, we see increased driving if truck drivers can't find parking and they have to search. That leads to road degradation and emissions. If they do have to make the difficult decision to park on a shoulder or ramp, you've got additional wear and tear on that facility. And of course, when that does happen, there's also lower visibility for the traveling public, which introduces a safety risk. So, this is really kind of a three-pronged issue. Next. In addition to the need, though, the time is really right to be looking at this issue. Over the last decade and a half, truck parking has just been building momentum. The requirement to report on inventory came about in 2012 with Jason's Law, but in the last few years, it's really picked up steam. In 2024, DOT made it more explicit that truck parking projects are eligible for different types of grant funding. And just this year, it was announced that $200 million of infra grant funding is earmarked for truck parking projects specifically. So it's really an excellent time to start thinking about where projects would be appropriate and tee yourselves up for some of this earmarked funding. Next. To that end, the objectives of this plan are to identify sites for near or midterm development. We're using input from the industry to understand where will be most helpful and why. And we want to make sure these sites are large enough that they can accommodate facilities that are community assets and, not eyesores, not vacant lots, that really have the, things like trash and lighting and et cetera that kind of insulate the community from the truck parking activity. The way we're getting there, we've got 3 technical stages. inventorying what's there today, looking at demand for truck parking, and then finally recommending sites for development. And there's 2 engagement stages, which we'll get to in a minute, one on needs and one on working through what the best solutions are. Next. For this effort, we've got a 12-month schedule. We're about halfway through right now. We are in the midst of our first round of engagement, focusing on industry and what their needs are. For the last several months, we've also been processing quite a large amount of truck GPS data, several terabytes of data to determine where trucks are parking and how they're getting there. So by the end of the year, you'll have a final report and list of recommended sites, and late summer, early fall, you may be hearing from us because in our second stage of engagement, we want to focus on the partners that could help deliver these projects, and also just kind of what communities would be looking for in these projects. Next slide. Moving on to what we found so far. Dedicated parking within the CAMPO boundaries is pretty limited. There's only one publicly owned site, and that is a picnic area in Hayes County that only has room for 3 trucks. Aside from that, the need is almost entirely met by private truck stops or even just lots that are available to trucks. But this deficit is really seen the most in the central urbanized area along I-35. If you were to zoom out and look at the entire state, there's kind of just a void right there in, Hayes, Travis, Williamson County along that corridor. Also importantly, of the 42 sites that we did identify in the region, only 20 of them have basic amenities, which we're defining as restrooms, trash, and lighting. And so I'll show you an example of what some of these no amenity, low amenity sites look like. Another important finding is that just outside of CAMPO, particularly on I-35 and I-10, there's quite a bit of truck parking. And so we understand that, drivers are not making decisions based on the boundaries of a jurisdiction. So we're considering how that interacts too with the region. So what all of that means for the study is that we're going to be looking at what's happening within a 20-mile buffer of the CAMPO area. We will not be making recommendations outside of the CAMPO area or identifying sites, but we need to understand the patterns that are happening there. What this also probably means is that staging and that ability to get to an appointment is quite underserved just by the fact that there are not designated locations in the central part of CAMPO. And that's likely leading to a lot of on-street parking, which we're investigating currently. Next. One of the first things we undertook, we looked at 7 sites that had already been identified in the statewide truck parking study several years ago. And we got occupancy counts done. So over the course of 2 weeks in February, from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m., got a count of how many trucks were parked at the 7 facilities that we were already aware of. The use of this is twofold. One, we need to calibrate the GPS data that we're using. All of the GPS data sets available are just samples. So this kind of lets us look at the same days and say, how representative is our sample, and how do we maybe need to adjust. But it also just gives us an early look at kind of the different elements of kind of how we see trucks using these facilities. If you go to the next slide, for example, the Loves on US 290 officially has room for 10 trucks, and our occupancy count had a max parking number of 40 trucks. So if we look at that, we see kind of to the right of your screen, there's the officially designated area, and to the left, you have a vacant area next to it that trucks are also using so that they have access to the building there that's on site. And so these initial occupancy counts kind of just give us a foundational groundwork, but all of the statistics that will be reported in this plan and used to prioritize sites will be based on a much larger GPS data set, so that we can look at seasonal peaks, day of week peaks, hourly peaks, and make sure we're really understanding the pattern of truck parking. Next. I mentioned, some of those informal and low amenity lots. Something that's very interesting is we found quite a number of semi-formal lots. These are areas where landowners are advertising that truck parking is allowed, but they're not necessarily designed for that purpose. You can see some pictures here, things like gravel lots that may or may not have a gate, a handful of parking spots available at a landscaping wholesaler. The important thing about these is they are helping the picture, but if a driver is going around looking for parking, they will never find these. And they also are not providing amenities that drivers need for a safe and secure break. So I thought that was a very interesting kind of having about half of the facilities that we found in the CAMPO region being these low amenity informal lots. Next, we'll move on to what's coming up and what you can expect to see from this plan going forward. We are currently in the first round of engagement, as I mentioned. So we're focusing on interviews with industry and publishing a survey for truck drivers. As I mentioned later in the project, we'll have a second stage with focus groups, and that'll really focus on what would it take to develop a project and what do communities need out of these projects to make them a good neighbor to the existing land uses. Next. As we're looking at supply and demand, this is, I mentioned we've been cranking through the GPS data for a few months now. We're looking at designated parking. So what's happening within the boundaries of sites that are specifically meant for truck parking. We're looking at undesignated parking, which is mostly on-street parking. It could be shoulders and ramps. It could be kind of an off-street in an industrial area. We're also tying parking to economic activity. And then we're looking at what is the future of truck parking demand going to be like. Next, I'll go through each of these very quickly. In the designated parking analysis for each site, we're using a tool called Locus. This is an offshoot from Cambridge Systematics, but we'll have basically a profile of each parking location, what kind of truck vocation, so is it short haul, long haul, et cetera, is parking there? What is the pattern by time of day, day of week, and month of the year? So we're going to use this type of analysis in the CAMPO region and in that 20-mile buffer. And again, this is validated using those occupancy counts that we collected. Next, on the undesignated parking analysis, we're looking at this through two lenses. Locus also has the ability to look at what's happening in the roadway right-of-ways. We're also looking at INRIX, a different data source. So what's important about this is by using these two different data sets that sample different truck populations, we've got probably the biggest combined GPS data set that you could possibly get. So from this, we're really digging deep into where undesignated parking is happening, since that's really where much of the need is, right? Next. In terms of tying truck parking to economic activity, we're looking at different clusters of industrial activity throughout the CAMPO region, what routes trucks are taking to access them and when they leave them, and where they're parking right before and after. Truck parking is really a derived demand from overall economic activity and freight activity. And so we want to be cognizant of that so that as we think about how the region grows and changes and development occurs, that anything recommended in this plan is still going to make sense in 5, 10, 20 years. Next. On that same note, as we look to forecasting truck parking demand, we'll have different methodologies for the pass-through traffic and the local traffic. But what's important for you to know is that we will be looking at future demand quantitatively, and then we'll also look qualitatively. What are we hearing about how autonomous trucking might affect this? There's a prevailing thought that parking locations today could turn into transition zones between autonomous and human-led trucking, or adopt another logistics function. And so again, this is just about making sure anything recommended is going to hold up against time. Next. All right, so this is where kind of what everything in the project is driving towards. The final stage is to identify locations that are recommended for truck parking. Our first filtering criteria will be basically a minimum requirements fatal flaw analysis. So is the parcel big enough? Is it undeveloped, or is it developed in a way that could be repurposed? How close is it to highways? Just kind of the basic, would this site possibly work? Then any parcels that advance past that, we'll start to look in a more detailed way at each one. Is the parcel configured in such a way that it would make sense? Or is it an odd shape that it would be difficult to fit meaningful parking capacity in? This is also where we want to look at really comparing the need to make sure the sites that are recommended are not only feasible, but they're also going to be effective at meeting the needs. So that's combining the unauthorized parking, overflow at designated parking locations, safety and crashes involving car trucks. So that second stage is where we really look at each site in greater detail. Next. What this results in is a detailed site prioritization matrix. So for each site, we'll have combined the feasibility information, the effectiveness information, and then any environmental and community impacts that we identify that kind of feeds back into that feasibility piece. And so this is kind of the final product other than the plan itself. That gives CAMPO a list of sites and areas to continue to explore and see if these are the right places to develop truck parking and what's the best path to move forward with those locations. And that's all from me. I'll pause for any questions for me or for Nirav.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Anyone have any comments or questions? Not seeing any. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
I just want to say one thing that, to the TAC, that we will be coming back multiple times to update you on the progress of creating the plan. And if you have input you want to provide, something that you think we're missing, something that you think we should consider, we really welcome that because what we are eventually going to come back with specific locations that we think would be suitable for truck parking. So we don't want it to come as a surprise to the TAC members or to any member agencies when we finally present the final product. So please feel free to email me and I'll be glad to send your input to the project team so they can incorporate that.
Awesome. Thank you, Nirav. That's very helpful. Anyone else have any comments? Great. Thank you so much. We'll move to item 8, report on transportation planning activities.
Yep, I think we just have one here. I'll hand it off to Will.
Okay. Thanks, Chad.
Hey, everyone. This is Will. This is just a notice that the fiscal year 2027, I suppose, SS4A grants are now open. So Safe Streets for All program applications for this NOFO are due in just about a month, May 26th. This cycle is awarding about $1 billion in planning and implementation funds for safety-related projects that appear in a qualifying safety action plan. If you recall, CAMPO adopted theirs, adopted one for the region last year, and some other agencies already have adopted their own. So please reach out to folks at CAMPO if you have any questions related to work on the RSAP as it relates to potential application for funding. We just wanted to tell folks that the NOFO is open. As Ryan alluded to earlier in his presentation, this is the last guaranteed year of funding for programs in the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. Likely we'll see some sort of continuation, but again, this is the last guaranteed year for funding of the SS4A program.
Great. Thank you for that, Will. Okay. Great. Well, with that, we'll go to item 9, which are Chair announcements. The next policy board meeting will be on May 11th, and our next TAC meeting will be on May 18th. And then with that, thanks everyone, and we'll adjourn the meeting 3:24.